Hey everyone, and welcome back to another video. My name is Tilly and I'm a strength and conditioning coach with my bachelor's and my master's in exercise and sport science. Today we're going to be talking all about cluster sets. We're going to be talking about some issues that might arise by using them, and we're going to be talking about the benefits, how best to program them, and just friggin' everything about them. If you're new here, please make sure to like and subscribe because it'll really help the channel out and it'll make me feel nice and warm inside. Now first of all, let's define a cluster set. I'm sure if you've clicked on this video you already have some idea, but let's just make sure that we're all on the same level before we get into it. A cluster set is where we take rest in between repetitions that are contained in a set. So instead of a traditional set where we would do 6 repetitions back to back and then we might take 2 minutes of rest at the end, a cluster set might look like 3 repetitions followed by 30 seconds of rest and then another 3 repetitions. Can you see the difference between the traditional and the cluster? It's not a hard definition, so let me know if I've just explained it badly. This kind of training, or the cluster set style, was created because in a traditional set we get quite a significant decrease in power output, speed, our strength decreases, and so it was a way to try and combat that. Theoretically, that makes sense, right? Because by adding more rest in between repetitions, you should be able to maintain your power output, your speed, your force, your strength, everything. Here's an example of how, in theory, our velocity should decline over a traditional set where we have no rest in between repetitions. So you can see that goes down there. And then here's an example of how theoretically a cluster set will work. Of course, there's going to be some change, but this is just in theory, so you can see it stays much more level. And this happens because a traditional set is going to decrease our ATP stores, our energy stores, and our phosphocreatine stores to a higher extent than a cluster set is going to. There's also going to be a greater deal of neuromuscular and metabolic fatigue associated with our traditional set schemes. And this is because in as little as 5 maximal contractions, then we can see massive changes or massive decreases in our force. But on the other hand, in a cluster set, with as little as 15 seconds rest, we can get restoration of over half of that fatigue-induced force decrement. And we can usually return our force-generating capacity to about 79% or so. And that's with only 15 seconds of rest. So imagine if we extended that a little bit longer. Here's another study to illustrate this benefit again. Cluster sets allow for that maintenance of power, as you can see. But you can see that the higher force outputs in the cluster sets, whereas in the traditional set where it says the 0, we see a really strong or significant decrease in the force as that set continues and as those repetitions go on. Another amazing thing about cluster sets is that they also cause us to have lower RPEs, or rating of perceived exertion. So that means that they make us perceive our workout or our training session as less difficult. So that's amazing. And that could really have some implications for when we're in a competitive season and we're training and we're feeling really fatigued from the games that we're having to compete in, all the training sessions. Cluster sets might be a really good tool to help you mitigate or lessen that RPE. Here's an example of how the traditional style of training and how it affects the RPE across 3 sets. And then next to it, we've got the RPE rating for 20-second cluster set and 40-second cluster set protocols. And you can see that the RPE rating for those are much, much lower. So you getting the gist? Are you kind of seeing how fantastic cluster sets are? I know I'm painting a beautiful picture. As you may have realized through some of this talking, if you haven't, that's completely fine too, but there are some things about cluster sets that don't exactly make sense. So for example, if you were doing a bench press and it takes you X amount of time to set up that bench press before you start, does it really make sense to then re-rack, take X amount of time again, and then restart the movement? Like, imagine how time consuming that would be, particularly if you're in a big team environment, you're sharing the gym, or if you're in a commercial gym and you're having to fight for equipment. You can't re-rack, then rack, then re-rack, then rack in between every repetition. Like, would you just hold the weight up instead of re-racking? Or do you completely re-rack and reset every time? For that reason, cluster sets are mostly recommended for power-based exercises. So think of things like weightlifting movements or weightlifting derivatives. You could even use them for jumping movements, like sets of jump squats, medicine ball movements, or anything that doesn't really require a huge amount of setup in between each rep. Depending on how long it takes you to get it set up, I suppose you absolutely could get away with them for movements like a deadlift or other bodybuilding movements, machines and things like that. Although it's really going to depend on your main goal of training, and I'm going to touch on that in a second. So overall, guys, cluster sets might not really be the best idea if you're super strapped for time. I personally would probably just lessen the rest period or shorten the rest period period a little bit because I think the benefits outweigh the other ones, but there's definitely some movements it just doesn't make sense to do. Now, there are a lot of different ways that we can program a cluster set and a lot of different ways that we can use it. I've taken some here from one paper, and we can see how these researchers have presented 3 different variations of a cluster set. You can see the first, they take about 12 seconds in between each rep. The second, they have 2 blocks of 30 seconds interspersed. And then the last, they have a big 60-second right in the middle. As a side note, and this will make sense in a second, it's really important to see that at the end of the set, they've still got the same 2-minute rest time recorded, okay? I'll remind you of that in a second. And here, if we come back to it, this is how our peak velocity changed with each of those cluster set setups. So you can have a look there, you can compare them. Remember, number 1 was the 12 seconds, number 2 was the 30 seconds, and cluster 3 was the 60-second rest. And here is how our jump squat performance changed compared to that first repetition. Regardless of the structure there, you can see that the sets performed with the cluster style performed much better than the traditional set did. So our reps were looking more similar, which could imply that we have a better training quality, and certainly from a technical perspective, it might mean that we're better able to retain skills and fatigue isn't compromising our movement. Now, I know those were 3 examples, but when you're choosing how long you should actually rest with your cluster set, there really is no right answer, and it's going to depend on your overall training goal, as with everything. So I'm taking these recommendations from the NSCA, but if you choose a shorter rest interval, say about 15 to 15 seconds, those shorter rest periods in between would probably work best within a strength endurance or a hypertrophy period of your training. If you extend this rest interval to between 15 to 30 seconds, then power development is probably going to be that targeted attribute that you're wanting to get or that you're aiming for. And this would pair really nicely with a strength or a strength power period of your training. Pair nicely. That makes me feel like I'm recommending a wine to you guys for you to taste. This would pair nicely with a strength or power period. I don't know why I went British. And finally, if we really wanted to focus on maximal power, so if you're wanting to get the highest possible power outputs that you can, then you would extend that rest even further, and you'd probably go something like 30 to 45 seconds. And that longer cluster set rest duration would be amazing for a strength power or a peaking period of your training. Might be really good for when you're getting closer to competition, when your volume of training might decrease, but the intensity is staying really, really high, and we want to stay fresh, and we want to get that lower RPE. There's lots of cool ways that we can apply it. Now that we know all of the basics of that and all of the cluster training in that respect, I'm going to introduce you to something that some researchers believe is the answer to your cluster set problems. And that problem is that cluster sets take too long. These researchers believe that this is a better version of cluster set training, but you let me know what you think down below. This type of training is called rest redistribution. It's where we simply relocate or move the total rest time in a traditional set and we put it in between the reps, like we would in a cluster set. Instead of just taking the 2 minutes at the end of your set, the researchers suggest that we should move, say, 90 seconds of that, put that into different places in between your reps. And what that would mean is that at the end of our set, we only have 30 seconds of rest left over. The researchers who made this thought that this would be a really good solution to the fact that cluster sets take way too long. But does anyone see the issue here? It's the same amount of rest as a traditional set. They've just rebranded it by moving it around. They're not giving us anything extra. To anyone who is actually trained or has actually tried to lift the heaviest amount of weight possible, this just makes no logical sense at all. Why would simply rearranging the rest position allow for us to maintain strength or to maintain power output? It wouldn't, because at the end of the set, we're still left with a shorter amount of time. Imagine doing a set of 5 really heavy deadlifts. You take about 22 to 23 seconds in between each lift, which is great. That might give you some time to breathe. But then at the end, you're still left with only 30 seconds before you start your next rep. It just doesn't make any sense. So in my eyes, and I'd love to know your thoughts, because also in the eyes of the literature, cluster sets remain supreme. We need the extra rest, so I don't know why they're trying to take it away. Here's a really good way of summing it up. Alternative set structures can reduce mechanical fatigue, perceptual exertion, and metabolic stress during and after resistance training. However, fundamental differences in in the amount of total rest time results in cluster sets generally being more effective than rest redistribution in alleviating fatigue-induced changes during resistance training. So that really highlights the importance of classifying cluster sets and rest redistribution independently. They can't be called the same thing anymore. And that makes sense, right? I hope we're all in agreement there. This is actually a major problem that we have in exercise science at the moment, and I'd love to know your thoughts on it. These researchers, who are very big within academia, do not train themselves and they do not train elite level athletes, but yet they are writing papers telling us how to change our training practices with no lived experience. It's kind of highlighting that we absolutely need some sort of marrying between the practical application of sports science and the theoretical basis. Otherwise, we're going to continuously get some silly sausage literature like the rest redistribution, and we don't want silly sausage literature. So if you're into training yourself, I really highly recommend that you do spend the time looking at some papers and learning about exercise science or exercise physiology. And if you prefer the theoretical side of things, then please make sure that you are still training to the best of your ability or the best that your body is able to, so that you can understand from a more informed position. Anyways, everyone, I hope you learned something new about cluster sets. I was thinking about making this video for a while. I think they're super cool. I don't use them that often, but I really see the application for a lot of different exercises. So I think they're fabulous. I hope you guys learned how they might be useful for you. And if you try them out, please do let me know down below. I would love to know what you think. And if you hated them, let me know why. I really do think the benefits outweigh the negatives, which really to me seems to be a time thing as the main negative. Report back how your training has differed if you do give them a go. I'd love to know. And as always, guys, please make sure to like and subscribe. It would be amazing to have you be a part of this little community, and it'll really help the channel out. Let me know what topics I should cover in the future. If you've got any particular questions about exercise science, drop them down below and I'll see if I can make a video about all of them soon. Thanks, guys. I'll see you next time. Have a good week. I've just noticed how shiny my forehead is with this overhead lighting. Shiny.